All right, guys, so we're going to pick up where we left off, Unit 5, so Day 2. Okay, so at this point, you should have already answered your warm-up questions. I think that was 5 questions from the stuff that we covered yesterday. So make sure you did that. Make sure you watched the video from yesterday, and then we're going to move on. All right, so today we're going to look at kind of the bridge between the politics of the 1920s and how that kind of spills over into like culture and society of the 1920s. Okay, so remember at the end of World War I, as the United States was entering the war, Russia was leaving the war because of the communist revolution taking over in that country. Okay, so when we look at communism, again, we see this communist symbol, and typically when we talk about the Red Scare, or when we talk about the color red, this is referring to these communist countries. So a lot of time red is associated with communism. Okay, so we see the Red Scare. So again, just kind of a review. Vladimir Lenin takes over Russia, the Bolsheviks. And again, he's kind of spreading this idea of communism, okay? Everybody kind of shares equally in society's wealth, okay? Everybody gives a little bit, everybody takes a little bit, but they did not believe in capitalism, which is what the United States kind of runs on. So again, you see this conflict between ideologies. You see this conflict of ideas. So this begins to spill over into American culture. Okay, so the Red Scare begins to take place in the United States. We fear this idea of communism. It's different. It goes against what we believe in economically. And we get this irrational fear that communism is going to spread to the United States, that we'll have a similar revolution in the United States. So if you look over at this political cartoon, the United States, okay, seems to be headed right towards the red iceberg. Remember, we associate that red with communism, and we see the communist symbol here, and all of these other countries that have already fallen to communism, okay? So the natural fear is, oh, the United States will be next. This fear also spills over to the way that we feel about immigrants within the United States. Now, we've already seen this trend of nativism all throughout American history, and we're going to see that spike up again. Mitchell Palmer is going to lead kind of this anti-communist campaign. And again, anybody could be suspected of communist. If you were different than your neighbors, you could be told as communist. If you were just more radical, extreme, you didn't believe in the traditional ideals, someone could accuse you of being communist. And these accusations flew everywhere. So these kind of attacks got nicknamed the Palmer Raids. And again, any suspected communist could be jailed, could be interviewed, anything like that. So again, you see kind of one of the Palmer Raids going on here. This did not go over so well with everybody. His house was going to be bombed. Sorry, I just hate that thing at the bottom of the screen. Go away. No. Guess we dealing with it. His house is going to be bombed in response to that. So it shows the tension that's going on over this Red Scare. Okay. So again, we see this idea of nativism or this anti-immigrant attitude because most of the ways that we feel that this idea of communism is going to be brought into the country is through kind of foreigners or through these immigrants. Okay. So again, they're being nicknamed Reds. We automatically assume that they are going to be communist. One famous kind of historical event that portrays this is going to be known as the Sacco Vanzetti trial. Basically, what has happened is there are Italian immigrants who are accused of a crime, to which it came out later that they actually did commit, but their trial was completely biased and unfair, and they ended up being given the death sentence without really having their side being heard at all. So again, a super famous example of kind of this nativist attitude. And then super important down here, we see the implementation of a quota. Okay, so when you set a quota, it's a certain limit, restriction, number that you have to meet. So the way the quota system works is that immigrants were restricted depending on where they were coming from. There was a quota set on how many immigrants could come to the United States. So this is basically a way that the United States could limit the amount of immigrants coming into the United States during this time. After World War One, again, remember, during the war, we had high demand for war goods. So businesses were growing. After World War One, we see kind of a dip for a certain amount of time. We see increased job competition. Women were kind of filling in those jobs while the men were at war. Now that the men are back, there's kind of competition of who's going to kind of fill in those jobs. Working conditions, remember, were not so good. So this caused striking all across the country. Okay, so at the same time period, because working conditions aren't good and they increase striking, at the same time, people were accused, if you went on a strike or you went against the government, you would be accused of being an anarchist. So you see kind of this anti-government sentiment during this time period as well. Just one thing I want to point out. So again, these workers, it's one step, it strikes, causes disorder, riots, then you're a Bolshevist, so you become, communist and a murderer, and it launches into chaos. So again, it's accusing anybody of who is striking as being an anarchist or being a communist and so on. During this time period, we also see, again, the rise of the KKK. So they're kind of empowered by this anti-immigrant or this nativist attitude. And we see, remember, during Reconstruction, they're predominantly kind of anti-minority. You also see them being anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, which means they're anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic. So again, if you weren't really aligned in believing specifically what the KKK believed, they also kind of presented themselves as a very Christian and holy type of organization, which we know is kind of an oxymoron. Okay, and then on the opposite side, we see that the 1920s, or known as the Roaring Twenties, is kind of this age of prosperity. Okay, there's a big upswing. People are partying. People are spending money, which we'll kind of learn that they didn't really have. But we see kind of this party lifestyle taking place during this time period. Okay, so some characteristics of this age of prosperity. Economically, we begin to expanding. We see the idea of mass production and the assembly line being put into use, and this becomes the age of the automobile. People are out and about and much more easily traveling. A big shift, and this is going to be super important during the 1920s. So we see all the developments taking place. And we see this taking place in the industries, not in agriculture. 1920s and 1930s are going to be a huge time of kind of despair and struggle when we talk about rural areas based on agriculture. Okay, with this, we're going to see this time period of urbanization. Okay, just like we talked about in the Gilded Age, we're going to see another boom where people begin moving to the cities. Okay, a little bit more productivity, a little bit more technology. But we see a decrease in demand. So again, at the same time people are moving to the cities, there's also an increase in job competition. And a lot of the times when you see this idea of urbanization, people are not moving directly into the cities, but just outside of the cities into suburbs, okay? And this paired with the automobile allows people to work in the cities, but live just outside of the cities. Okay, and this is the second Great Migration. We've talked about a Great Migration of Pilgrims in American History 1. The Great Migration of the 1920s is going to particularly pertain to African Americans who are taking advantage, okay, of this boom of industries during World War I and seeking opportunities in industries, okay? The big center for this is going to be Harlem in New York City. And then out of Harlem, we see a distinct black culture. So black artists, black musicians, Black authors, Black poets. All of this coming out of here, creating kind of this revolution or movement. Okay, so you see again moving particularly out of the South in the map, okay, and then moving into these major cities from the West Coast, but particularly in the Northeast. Okay, so again, they're moving away from that discrimination in the South and they're moving to economic opportunities in the North. Okay, so out of Harlem, kind of the center of culture, is going to come the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so a huge cultural movement, and again, we have these famous artists, authors, musicians, dancers, all coming out of Harlem. Langston Hughes is a famous example. He's an author. You've probably read some of his works. He came out of the Harlem Renaissance. Bessie Smith. Just kidding, it won't work. I was going to show you flapper dancers. I'll post another one under the video when I post this. Okay, and then we see this era of jazz. Okay, so we see Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, again, famous musicians of this time, and the Harlem Renaissance and kind of this jazz movement or this jazz era kind of go hand in hand. Okay, while some people through the Harlem Renaissance are able to move up into society, Marcus Garvey starts the Back to Africa movement. And basically saying African Americans should move back to Africa, basically start their own independent lifestyle in Africa. So because economic and social equality was really slow to move in the United States and wasn't being achieved, he encouraged African Americans to return to Africa. Wasn't very successful. Very few people actually left the United States. All right, so stop there, and I'm going to finish the rest of kind of the culture and society and the lifestyle of the 1920s tomorrow.